So hello everyone, welcome to the Insightful Minds in International Macro Rising Star Seminar Series. So this year we invited seven job market candidates from top universities to talk about their job market papers. So today is our first day of the Rising Star series, and we will also have the Rising Star seminars tomorrow and the day after tomorrow at the same time. Today we are happy to have Dongchen Zhou from University of Pennsylvania, Yassine from New York University, and Wentong from Cornell University to give us the talks about their job market papers. So each presentation will take 15 minutes, and I think we can ask if you have any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask the presenters. So now we will start from Dongchen. Dongchen, can you start your talk? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ren, for presenting the topics, and thank you all for inviting me to this great conference. I'm Dongchen. I'm a PhD candidate in finance at Wharton. My job market paper is topicked as bond demand and the yield exchange rate nexus, risk premium versus convenience yield channel. So one big, okay, sorry. Oh, yes, that works. So one big fundamental empirical relationship in international finance is this positive yield and exchange rate correlation. So empirically, we observe when there's a country increase in the domestic bond yields, you will see an increase in the domestic currency value. So recent studies using this preferred habitat frameworks highlights the role of demand and supply of government bonds in this joint valuation. For example, we see Greenwood, Hansen, Stein, and Sundaram in 2023 QJE paper, as well as Grinshas, Ray, and Vallanos in their working paper, highlights this role of government bond demand in this joint valuation. And they not only imply a positive yield and exchange rate correlation, but they also draw upon this policy implications. For example, how demand for government bonds from central banks can have this impact on bond yields as well as the currency value along this positive direction. And yet, this positive relation is not always consistent. Why is it not consistent? So during periods in which liquidity demand is a dominant source of variations, you can see this positive relation can dampen or even reverse. And in my paper, I document that conditional on the changes in bond demand, this yield and exchange rate relation is actually negative, which is the opposite to the typical observation. So let me give you some examples. One example would be Canada. I just look at the newspaper, and there it is. And there are two news articles. The titles is almost the same, but they have the completely opposite implications for the yield and exchange rate relation. First one, it says there will be negative correlation. The second one, it says it will be a positive correlation. So there's a relation between yields and exchange rates. It's not always consistently positive, like the standard international finance literature would predict. Another example would be the yield and exchange rate relation across different horizon, different time period. For example, in September and October 2019, you will see this yield and exchange rate relation being highly positively correlated. Well, during 2022, in September, of course, there is something going on, which is what we call the gilt crisis. You can see this yield and exchange rate relation turns negative. And actually, the correlation is negative 0.7, which is highly significant. So what my paper does is to disentangle this effect of government bond demand in addressing this complex yield and exchange rate relation. I documented there are two channels through which changes in government bond demand affects yields and exchange rates. The first one is the risk premium channel, and the second one is the convenience yield channel. I'll get into more details about what these two channels mean. And specifically, these two channels will have the same effect on the bond yields. However, they will have a countervailing effect on the exchange rates, addressing this complex yield and exchange rate relation. I'll provide a simple model for illustration, and I will provide some empirical evidence to demonstrate these two channels. And specifically, when there's an increase in government bond demand, it reduces the amount of risk that is held by these global margin investors. Because these margin investors will have limited risk-bearing capacity, this effectively frees up the capacity to take on foreign risk. So they will have a reduction in the risk premium, which lowers the bond yields, but also lowers the domestic currency value. So through that channel, you will see positive correlation between bond yields and exchange rates. So lower bond yields and also lower domestic currency value. The second convenience channel operates through the liquidity preference. When there's an increase in government bond demand, there will be an increase in convenience yield or higher liquidity value attached to domestic safe assets, which includes domestic long-term bonds and also the domestic currency. So you will see through this channel, the domestic bond yields is lower, but you will see an increase in the domestic currency value. So conditional to that channel, the yield and exchange rate covariance will be negative. So I address.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yes.
I think what you say is sometimes the bond yields is positively correlated with the exchange rate. Sometimes it's negative. It depends on whether the risk premium channel or the convenience yields channel dominate.
Mm-hmm.
But
Absolutely.
then the question is, everything is conditional on the bond demand shock, right? But the correlation you show is the unconditional moments. So how do you know whether it's only bond demand shock is driving everything, or this correlation change can be due to other shocks as well?
Yes, so that's what I document empirically. So what I document empirically is that conditional on this bond demand shock, actually the covariance between yields and exchange rate is negative. Unconditionally, we see this positive unconditional covariance. And existing literature, including this preferred habit frameworks, struggle to reconcile these contrasting patterns in which we see an unconditional positive covariance, but conditional on demand and supply for government bonds is negative. Okay. So this is what I'm going to address in the empirical section. So what I formalized these channels is I use this preferred habitat framework with this additional liquidity preference, or the benefits over holding safe sovereign assets into this framework. And I show that these two competing channels, the risk premium channel as well as the convenience channel, show up in the model. And it also generates predictions that are consistent with the empirical findings. Specifically, I find that positive bond demand shocks will lead to lower yields and also domestic currency appreciation. And it also illustrates the equilibrium yield and exchange rate relationship with these frameworks. I show that in general, the unconditional covariance between yields and exchange rate should be positive without this demand and supply risk, but this covariance between yields and exchange rate can be dampened or even reversed if the variations in the bond demand or liquidity preference is significantly present. Empirically, to test these channels through which government bond demand affects the asset prices impose a challenge because the demand and supply are equilibrium outcomes. So I utilize these institutional features of government bond auctions in the G10 currency. Specifically, government agencies will pre-announce the supply side information such as issuance size, coupon rates, specific maturities to be issued prior to the auction. So what is left to be reviewed during the auction is the revelation about demand. So I use bid to cover ratio to measure the demand shock. Specifically, the bid to cover ratio is calculated as the amount of bids scaled by this total issuance size. So higher bid to coverage ratio is associated with a stronger demand reviewed through an auction. And using this bid to coverage ratio and controlling for cross-country heterogeneity as well as the past auction results, I document several main findings. First, an increasing bond demand through an auction is associated with a lower bond yield, which is predicted, but also a stronger domestic currency. And furthermore, investigating in the convenience yield or liquidity attached to these sovereign bonds, I find that an increasing bond demand is associated with a higher convenience yield, not just for the long-term bonds, but also across the short-term maturities. So there is a uniform increase in convenience yields for domestic safe assets. And these findings suggest that this convenience yield channel dominates the risk premium channel in which the government bond has an effect on the exchange rates. And further, to examining these two separate channels, I impose an exchange rate decomposition. Specifically, I decompose the exchange rate movements into three components: the risk premium, the cash flow component, which consists of the interest rate differentials in the short term, and the convenience yield differential yields. What I find is that an increasing bond demand is associated with a stronger domestic currency, primarily because of its increase in the convenience yield news. So it pops up the convenience yield news. However, it has a dampening effect on the currency value because it has reducing the risk premium channel. So overall, if we look at the yield and exchange rate covariance, we see that this convenience yield channel actually dampens this positive yield and exchange rate covariance unconditionally. Even though on both auction versus non-auction day, we see this positive unconditional covariance. So for literature, there's abundant literature talking about how demand for government bonds affects the exchange rates and yields. There are also abundant literature talking about how liquidity value attached to domestic safe assets can have an effect on the exchange rates. For example, Jiang, Krishnamurthy, and Lustig, 2021, and Engel and Wu, 2023, they discuss this convenience yield channel through which this convenience yield is reflected as a safe asset demand related to or liquidity premium attached to these exchange rate movements. Of course, there are also papers talking about risk premium and exchange rates in which exchange rates are corresponding to risk premium that is common also in the long-term bonds. There are also papers talking about how liquidity and convenience yield play a role in the government debts. For example, Krishnamurthy and Vincent Jorgensen talking about how supplies and demand of government bonds can affect the convenience yield or liquidity values attached to these sovereign assets. So to formalize this channel.
Can I ask a quick question? Usually people don't ask questions for literature reviews, but you mentioned Zheng Yang's paper and Steele's paper. That's also the paper I thought about when I read your paper. So especially your exchange rate decomposition, that Zheng Yang's Journal of Finance paper also has such a decomposition. Then my question is, what additional thing you find, which is different from or complement Zheng Yang's results?
So what I additionally find is, first, I find that there's changes in bond demand. I isolated with the bond auctions. It's associated with appreciation primarily because of this positive effect on the convenience yield, while it has a negative effect on the exchange rates because it reduces the foreign exchange risk premium. So actually, there are two channels have countervailing effect on the exchange rates. And because its effect on convenience yield dominates, and as a result, I see appreciation of the domestic currency.
So what do you say is Zheng Yang's paper do not have a risk premium, but your paper had the risk premium channel, right?
They also do have risk premium. So what they do is they do a exchange rate decomposition like I do.
Right.
And it talks about how first of all, the impulse response function, as well as the variance decomposition. I also do a similar decomposition, but their paper is trying to emphasize this liquidity or what they call a convenience channel, which have a sizable variance that could explain this exchange rate movements. They actually find pretty comparable variations explained by convenience yields versus the risk premium.
Okay.
Thank you. So let me formalize these channels to which bond demand affects the yields and exchanges. So it will be a two-country model with two types of assets. There will be a short-term bills and long-term bonds in both domestic and foreign country. And there will be a short-term interest rate and a long-term bonds. The long-term bonds will be perpetuity with this coupon K. And I do a return approximation around this log normal approximation, so you can get a linearized returns for the perpetuity bonds. And the foreign exchange is denoted as QT in units of foreign currency per unit of domestic currency. So higher QT means that the domestic currency value is increasing. And the small q denotes the log exchange rates. Okay. So the interest rate will be an exogenous process for both domestic and foreign T-bills. They will have independent exogenous process, while their residual or the shocks could be correlated with a positive correlation. And specifically, I have this bond demand in this model. The bond demand will come from the habitat investors for both domestic and foreign long-term bonds. So lambda denotes this bond demand, and domestic and foreign bond demand will be orthogonal. So what exactly is this lambda? What exactly is habitat investors, first of all, is you can think about it as pension funds, insurance companies, or specific investment funds that will invest in the term habitat with respect to their home currencies. Specifically in here, it will be denotes as demand for long-term bonds in their respective home country. I see in the chat. Okay, sorry, no worries. Okay,
so that's a question for me, so we will post the videos later. Yeah.
Okay, no problem. So these demand will follow an exogenous process driven by the liquidity needs. So what is the empirical counterpart? The empirical counterpart here would be the bond demand reviewed through an auction. So I will use auction to isolate this exogenous shifts in demand. Okay. So I will also have residual bond supplies here, although it's not necessary, but to get a pretty symmetric equilibrium, I put it here. It was just a residual bond supplies that is coming elsewhere that are orthogonal to this bond demand shocks. So the net bond supply will be the supply minus demand. So there's residual supply minus the bond demand will be the net bond supplies that is faced by the bond investors. And the global bond investors here is the margin investors for both domestic and foreign bond markets. The global bond investors will choose the bond portfolio holdings to solve this mean variance utility maximization problem with this additional M here. So this M here denotes the liquidity preference over holding domestic or foreign safe assets, which includes, you can see here, the domestic long-term bonds, the foreign long-term bonds, as well as the foreign exchange. So the DSD here will be the market value of holdings. The tau here will be the risk tolerance, and the gamma here will be the liquidity preference. So higher gamma will be associated with higher liquidity value attached to these assets. This eta here is the relative liquidity value or transmission of the liquidity value from long-term bond to the short term. If eta is equal to 1, that means there is a perfect transmission of the liquidity value from the long-term regime to the short term. So what exactly is this liquidity preference? So this liquidity preference, you can think about it as a pecuniary or non-pecuniary benefits over holding this liquid safe assets. There are several possible micro foundations here. First, you can think about it as changes in liquidity supply like Krishnamurthy and Vincent Jorgensen's paper talking about how changes in debt to equity, debt to GDP ratio is associated with changes in the convenience yields or liquidity value attached to the sovereign bonds. Here, changes in demand for that domestic bonds is associated with changes in the liquidity value attached to these domestic safe assets. So another way to think about it is this demand reflects some information about the liquidity value, probably in some other markets, such as the repo markets. So empirical counterparts will include the collateral demand, which they demand for domestic safe assets as value of valuable collateral, or they have some repo lending profits that could be generated outside of this portfolio allocation problem. So what these model reviews? So in equilibrium, we will have demand that satisfies this utility maximization problem. And we also have bond and foreign exchange market clears. Specifically, we will have zero net supply for the FX demand. We don't assume if we have a higher demand for domestic bonds, we'll have a higher demand for the domestic currency. And that will be mechanical demands for the currency. So here we shut down this mechanical demand for the currency channel, in which we focus on this valuation effect on the exchange rates. So the equilibrium expected returns will be, if we do a 4 iteration, we will have this static rates for yields as well as the exchange rate. So the domestic long-term bond yields will be the sum of expectation hypothesis, which is just the interest rate of the future past, the bond risk premium, minus this convenience yield differential, for that domestic bonds. And the exchange rate will be equal to the sum of the UIP, which is the uncovered interest rate parity. You can think about it as the total future past of the interest rate differentials, and plus this FX risk premium, which consists of the supply risk, as well as this convenience yield differentials, which coming out from this liquidity preference. So what are the implications for this model? So the proposition 1 here states that if we have no demand or supply risk, the unconditional covariance between yields and exchange rates will be positive. However, if we consider a change in bond yield, so this bond demand shock will reduces the equilibrium bond yields, while the demand shock will increase this exchange rate if this marginal liquidity preference value overweighs the price of interest rate risk. Let me give you a more specific way to think about it. So these rise in bond demand, which is the change, an increase in lambda, is associated with higher domestic currency through these 2 countervailing channels. First, it has a negative effect on the currency value by reducing the foreign currency risk premium. Why is that? Because, first of all, marginal investors have this limited risk-bearing capacity coming from the positive risk tolerance. So because they have limited risk-bearing capacity, an increasing demand from habitat investors will reduce the equilibrium holdings for these global bond investors. By market clearing condition, that should hold. Because of this reduction in bond holdings, it effectively reduces the quantities of risk held by these global bond investors. So the risk premium will be the quantities of risk times the price of risk. Because the quantities of risk is reduced, the risk premium is reduced as a result. So it will be a lower risk premium because a change in demand frees up the capacity for investors to take on foreign assets, which includes the foreign currencies. And as a result, the domestic currency will depreciate. So you will see through this channel, risk premium channel, an increase in bond demand will be associated with domestic currency depreciation. The next channel here is the convenience yield channel. The convenience yield channel operates through the liquidity preference. When there's an increase in bond demand, this increasing lambda reflects into a higher liquidity preference over holding domestic safe assets because margin investors care about the liquidity value of domestic assets. And that is associated with higher liquidity value attached to domestic bonds and also the short-term bills. And as a result, the domestic currency will appreciate when there's an increase in demand. So you can see these two channels have a countervailing effect on the exchange rates, and depending on the relative magnitude, it will either increase or decrease the currency value depending on the relative size of these two channels. And these effects can be extended to cases in which I have positive bond demand or even positive residual bond supply risk. So what does it say about the unconditional covariance? So we see that without this demand or supply risk, this unconditional covariance between yields and exchange rate will be always positive. It was because the only source of risk here is the interest risk. And because both long-term bonds in the domestic currency as well as the foreign currency, foreign exchange have the same beta loadings or same directional beta loading on both long-term bonds and foreign exchange, unconditional covariance between bond yields and exchange rates will be positive. But how will these variations in bond demand affect this equilibrium covariance between yields and exchange rates? If we assume that this liquidity value, the marginal liquidity value coming out, is higher than the price of interest risk, an increase in this demand shock will lead to a higher domestic currency value. And as a result, unconditionally, we will see that the positive yield and exchange rate relationship will be dampened. And in other words, if there's variations in liquidity preference is higher, we see a lower unconditional covariance between yields and exchange rates. So it provides some testable predictions that could guide us into this empirical section. First, assume we have positive variations in liquidity preference and unconditional covariance between yields and exchange rates is positive, then the model predicts that a higher bond demand is associated with a lower domestic bond yields, which is typical, but a higher bond demand is associated with a higher domestic convenience yields and a lower foreign exchange rate risk premium. And if this convenience yield channel dominates, we will see increasing bond demand associated with an increase in the domestic currency value. And finally, if the convenience yield channel dominates, we will see higher variations in bond demand is associated with a lower unconditional covariance between yields and exchange rates. So empirically, to test these channels through which government bond demand affects the exchange rates impose a challenge because demand and supply are equilibrium outcomes. So I isolate this exogenous shocks in government bond demand using this government bond auctions. Specifically, the supply side information such as issue size, coupon rates, maturities information will be released prior to the auction. And what is left to be reviewed during the auction is the information about demand. And this is an ideal environment for isolating demand surprises. So let me give you a timeline of what a typical government bond auctions look like. So a typical government bond auctions will have a fiscal plan. So the fiscal plan will be usually months or quarters prior to the auction. They would draft up the planned issuance, the overall issue size, the overall government budget. So this are related to the supply side information. And 2 to 7 days prior to the auction, there will be an auction announcement. The auction announcement is related to size, maturities, or specific coupon rates for the bond auction. So the supply side information has been fully reviewed prior to the auctions, leaving these bond auctions as a revelation about demand information. And I pick 8 currencies from the advanced economies: Australia, Canada, Germany, British pounds, Japan, New Zealand, Sweden, as well as Norway. I drop out Switzerland because their announcements will be on the same day as the auction takes place. So it's hard to isolate with daily frequency whether this information is coming out as a supply shock or demand shock. So my focus was on 2002 and 2022 and 10-year bond auctions, which is the most popularly issued long-term bond across countries. And these auctions will be consistently and regularly issued by the authority. Okay. And the empirical measure of demand is this bid to cover ratio. So the bid to cover ratio is calculated as the total dollar amount of bids divided by the face value amount of bids divided by the total issue size. And I use this changes in bid to cover ratio is as the deviations in the current bid to cover ratio from the past 10 average. The interpretation is that an increase in bid to cover ratio means that there will be an increase in demand compared to the past auction results for that bond at that maturities. The key features include it is a quantity-based demand measure, and it is also consistent, a stable measure across countries. We do see that as a summary table here. We do see that across countries, the level of bid to cover ratio was pretty heterogeneous. So Australia, you can see Japan, New Zealand would typically have a higher level of bid to cover ratio, meaning that they will have a higher demand in general. But once I control for changes in the past auction results, you can see that these bid to coverage ratio changes is surrounded around 0. So it was pretty stable and pretty consistent across different advanced economies. So using this, yes.
So when I quickly read your paper, I think it would be interesting if you can plot the because this variable, because this variable is crucial for your empirical analysis. And it will be also interesting to see if there's any co-movement among these different bonds, right?
So in terms of co-movement, I do see. So one thing I checked was the coordination in auctions, which is also associated with co-movement. They will be they might be coordination across these advanced economies in terms of its bond issuance, which could impact its correlation in terms of the exchange rates. What I do see is only 10%. So of these bond auctions occur at the same day. In other words, there is very little coordination across these advanced economies. For example, Japan, they will usually auction their 10-year government bonds at the first week of each month. However, for US, it will usually be the second week of each month.
Right. So I remember that there was a paper by Majori's team basically try to look at what currency is the international currency. They just look at this positions of different funds. So if they co-move with the US, the correlation with the holding of the US assets, then we categorize them as a safe assets and the currency is international currency. If the co-movement is negative, they consider it's not a safe asset. So when I talk about the co-movement, I'm thinking, okay, whether this is like the investor's perception on the riskiness or the properties of these bonds. So it could be different from between like advanced economies or you don't have emerging economies, but it could be different from currency to currency. Right?
That's a very good point. I think I should double check on the co-movement. I do have in my paper the co-movement between the bond itself as well as its equity markets. I do see it has some predictive power on the covariance, which is consists of the hedging property with respect to the domestic government bonds. But I can definitely double check on the co-movement in the international setting.
Okay.
And yeah, so with this changes in demand, I document my two main results. First, an increase in bond demand revealed through an auction is associated with a decline in the bond yields. So you can see prior to the auction, this changes in demand does not reacted to the past yields. That means this demand is really consists of a shock or surprises that is revealed at the same day of the auction. And at the auction day, you see 1 unit increase in the bid to coverage ratio is associated about 3 basis point decline in the bond yields. So 1 unit was about 3 standard deviations changes in the bid to coverage ratio. And this 3 basis point changes in the bond yields actually last more than 5 days, is last about 2 weeks. And
Sorry,
I also looked at, yes.
So are these bonds, so are these an aggregate measure of bond? Like
So
what's the maturity or how does it map to the, the issuance of this bid to cover bonds?
Yes, so this is the benchmark bond yield for 10-year government bonds. So this would be the 10-year government bond benchmark bond yields. And you can see there's a higher bid to coverage ratio associated with the benchmark bond yields. It is not a aggregation of the bond yields.
Okay, so the bid to cover would be whatever issuance on that issuance day, like maybe the issue 3-month, 10-year, a mix of everything, but the yield that you are looking at are 10-year yield.
Yes, I'm looking at the
Okay.
10-year government bond auctions as well. So
Okay.
yes.
Oh, you only look at 10-year government bond auctions.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Okay, thank you.
And this is also the 10-year government bond auction demand, but it is associated with a term structure response across different maturities. You can see a higher bid to coverage ratio associated with the 10-year government bond auctions has a most pronounced effect on the 10-year government bond yields. Well, has a slope, which is a pretty nice slope, which reflects this localization patterns in which this effect is more pronounced for the long-term bonds than for the short-term maturities. So next, I look at the currency response. So an increase in bond demand revealed through an auction is associated with an increase in domestic currency value. A 1 unit increase in bid to coverage ratio is actually associated with about 16 basis point increase in the domestic currency value, which lasts about 1 week. And it also have post-auction effect, which about 20 basis points after the auctions. So on the same day as the auction, there's about 16 basis point. Another 20 basis point goes through after the auctions and lasts about 1 week and a half. So next, I look at this convenience yield channel. So I test this convenience yield channels by measure the convenience yield using treasury premiums, which you can think about it as the difference in yields between the real bonds versus the synthetic bonds constructed with foreign counterparts. The foreign counterparts here would be the US dollar treasury, the US treasuries plus the FX forwards. So it was a currency hedged domestic bonds, foreign bonds. The yield differentials will be regarded as the convenience yield that is imposed for the domestic bonds compared to its foreign synthetic counterparts. And what I see is that an increasing bond demand.
So,
yes.
So your convenience yield is in relative terms, right? So it's kind of the treasury basis, the difference in treasury basis for two countries, right?
Right. That's correct. That's correct. So it was the difference in treasury basis between the domestic country versus the United States. So here specifically, it was about U.S. treasuries as the counterpart. And what I see is that an increase in bond demand revealed through an auction is associated with a higher convenience yield, not just for 10 years, but also across 7, 5, a little bit of 3, and also 1 year maturity. So there was a uniform or a global effect on the convenience yields, about 1 basis point per unit increase in bid to coverage ratio. I also look at alternative convenience yields such as OIS, sovereign basis, spread, as well as the investment-grade corporate bond sovereign spreads, I see similar results that there is a transmission of the government bond demand from long-term bonds to the short-term safety premium. So to discuss this, these findings suggest that there is, conditional on this bond demand changes, there is a negative covariance between yields and exchange rates, which is the opposite to the typical observation. So the typical observation would be the yields and exchange rates are positively correlated. But conditional on this bond demand changes, the yields and exchange rate actually could move negatively. And this suggests that through the model, this convenience channel has a dominating effect compared to the risk premium channel in the effect of bond demand on exchange rates. And I also see that this convenience yield increases across not just for long maturities, but also across to the short-term maturities, which is a necessary condition for the convenience channel to be effective on the domestic currency value. But the pursuing question is, how much for each channel through which this bond demand has an effect? And to resolve this, I use this Jiang, Krishnamurthy, Fruit, and Kamadori exchange rate decomposition. Specifically, I decompose the exchange rate movements into three news components. And this exchange rate movements or exchange rate innovations can be constructed as the sum of cash flow news, which consists of innovations in interest rate differentials, the convenience yield news, which is the innovations in the convenience yield differentials, as well as this risk premium news, which consists of innovations in the foreign exchange risk premium. So what I see is that an increase in bond demand through an auction is associated with 16 basis point increase in the exchange rates, primarily through this increase in the convenience yield news. So 16 basis point changes in exchange rates, increase in the exchange rates, about 16.7 is coming from this convenience yield news. However, it does have a negative effect on the risk premium. Actually, about 7 basis point is coming from a reduction in the risk premium, which lowers the domestic currency value. And
I have a couple of questions here. The first question is, how do you measure the risk premium? You need a measure of risk premium here, right?
Right. So here I measure the risk premium as the changes in the expected future returns. So it will be the I do it in the daily frequency. Specifically, I do a VR decomposition. So this risk premium will be just the currency excess returns coming out from the daily frequency.
Okay. And another thing is that when you do this, you need to evaluate the expectation. You also use VAR to.
I use VAR. Yes.
Okay. Then would the results change if your VAR changed?
It is possible. So the next iteration, I will add some additional variables into this VAR decomposition to see if that significantly changes the results.
Then finally, my final question is whether these different news can be independent from each other or not independent from each other.
It is not necessarily independent from each other because, first of all, without this convenience news imply, so these convenience yield differentials is actually coming from the Jiang, Krishnamurthy, and Lustig model, talking about there is a wedge between the domestic and foreign Euler equations. So coming out from that models, they construct this VAR decomposition. So without this wedge, we will see this risk premium channel will subsume this convenience channel. So if we don't have this convenience channel at all, we will see an increase in this currency value primarily through an increase in the risk premium, which is counterintuitive to the responses to not just the standard preferred habitat frameworks, but also in my frameworks.
But is your next page the table shows the contribution, or just
so here right now
decompose it and then run the regression and then see what is the coefficient? Is that what you're doing?
Could you reiterate this question?
I mean, what information do you want to convey? Yeah, I mean, you probably have mentioned it. So what is the key information you want to convey here?
Yeah, so key information is that this increase in demand appreciates the domestic currency primarily through its positive effect on convenience yield, while it does have a depreciation effect. So it lowers the domestic currency value because it reduces the foreign currency risk premium. So you see these two new components. One is negative, one is positive. They have a countervailing effect on the exchange rate when there is an increase in government bond demand.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, so I think I was talking about this, and I also look at unconditional covariance of yields and exchange rates during auctions versus non-auction days. So the intuition is that during these auction days, there will be a significant variations in the bond demand because it was days about revelation of bond demand. So we will expect this.
Sorry, I have a dumb question. I mean, regarding the exercise, the last exercise, like you need to impose some VAR structure to do the decomposition. I feel like you can just regress exchange rate on convenience yield and instrument that with your bid to cover ratio. And in that sense, you will say bid to cover explain the exchange rate through the convenience yield channel. And then you don't need to rely on this VAR structure, right?
But yeah,
you will impose the relationship has to go through convenience yield. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I see what you mean. So you're thinking about some using bid to cover ratio as an instrument.
Yeah.
In this VAR.
Yeah. I feel like that is exactly. I mean, the last exercise, like you basically show the relationship between this coverage ratio with yield and then with convenience yield and with exchange rate. And I think that's what basically an IV regression is trying to capture. So I like this exercise, but I was like, you might be like Ren was saying, like you might be assuming some VAR structure that might be sensitive to that. Like, yeah. But yeah. Anyway.
Yes, that's a totally good point. Thanks so much. Yeah, thanks so much for this.
I feel like you are running out of time, so I will
okay.
Keep going.
Yes. So yeah. So finally, my result also speaks to this unconditional covariance. You can see during non-auction days, also auction days, both yield and exchange rate covariance will be positive. So you will see the covariance to be positive. That was because this bond yields primarily reflects this risk premium channels. Well, of course, this VAR structure is important here, but the yields is positively associated with exchange rate movements in both auction and non-auction day. However, you can see that it is dampening during auction days, this unconditional covariance, because although the risk premium news is pretty similar in magnitude, the convenience news is 5 times as large as the non-auction days. And this covariance is significantly dampened through this convenience channel because the bond yields, as a price measure of demand, increasingly reflects this liquidity values during auction days. And because the variations in demand during auction days is significantly larger to non-auction days, this unconditional covariance between yields and exchange rates is dampened. And in conclusion, my paper asks a question: how does this government bond demand affect yields and exchange rates? I show that there are 2 channels, the risk premium and convenience channels, which has a countervailing effect on the exchange rates, which can address this complex yield and exchange rate relation over time. And my paper highlights this role of liquidity preference in the joint valuation of government bond and FX market, which could have important policy implications. For example, how there's changes in the BOE intervention, which is a QE type intervention, could reduce its yield, but increases the currency value because it contains a very large liquidity valuation. All right, thanks so much.